In 1979, schools on the Navajo Reservation had about 80% of students speaking Navajo. 10 years later, 5%. There's just too much English influence to really be effective in keeping our language. If the Navajo language is lost, we will not be a unique people. We will have no culture. We will have no prayers. This is a quote from Marilyn Begay, a 5th grade teacher at the Navajo Language Immersion School on the Navajo Nation Reservation in Arizona. The Navajo, a Native American group of the United States Southwest, face many of the same problems that indigenous people across the world do: the loss of their native language and culture in the context of globalization. Currently, there are approximately 7,000 languages that people speak around the world. But by the end of the century, about half of those languages will be gone. Most of the languages are spoken by small, isolated groups. As these groups become integrated into the larger society, the people often learn the language of the majority. The traditional language falls into disuse and becomes extinct. Since language is the key element in communication, with this loss of the language comes a loss of a central part of the group's history and cultural identity. As the Navajo example illustrates, language is essential to a group's culture. It creates a sense of place and a cultural landscape. The Navajo experience shows that today's communication technologies are reshaping culture and bringing drastic change to, and even destroying, age-old practices and languages. Yet language, like all elements of culture, have long been changing. The earliest languages spread from their cultural hearths and faced a multitude of local, international, and global forces, including conquest, colonialism, imperialism, and trade, up to the globalization and widespread instant communication of the present day. Currently, linguists, who are scientists that study languages, think that humans first began communicating through spoken sounds as recently as tens of thousands of years ago, or as long as a few 100,000 years ago. They are not sure how language diffused. Was it through the dispersion of people who carried the language with them as they dispersed across the planet? Or was it through transmission, as people learned language from their neighbors? Or was it through conquest, with one people imposing language on others? Linguists are also not sure whether all languages descended from one original language. They do believe that nearly all of the languages spoken today can be grouped into about 15 families of languages. The relationship among these language families is often shown on a language tree because it suggests how several languages are related to each other, as well as how one language grows out of another. The distribution of languages reflects human migrations. The migration of Huns from Central Asia to Central Europe around 1500 years ago explains why the languages most like Hungarian are found nearly 3,000 miles east of it. One of the 15 major language families is the Indo-European language family, which is a large group of languages that might have all descended from a language spoken about 6,000 years ago. Nearly half of the world's population speaks one of the languages of the Indo-European language family. This family includes about 2.8 billion native speakers of between 400 and 500 languages. Within Indo-European, one of the branches is Latin. The history of Latin shows how difficult the study of language is. Languages constantly evolve as people move away from the language's cultural hearths because of contact with other languages or isolation from other languages. 2,000 years ago, when the Roman Empire dominated much of what is today Europe, people in that empire spoke Latin. However, as the empire dissolved starting in the 5th century, transportation became more dangerous and trade declined. As a result, Latin speakers became geographically isolated from each other. The unifying language of Latin diverged into distinct regional languages known as Romance languages. Much of these later vanished, but Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanesque survived and grew. The historical connection among these languages is still evident today in their similar words. Languages can be further divided into smaller categories by other traits. One is by accent, how words sound when they're pronounced. Accents often reflect social class or geographic region. These boundaries between variations in pronunciations or word usages are called isoglosses. Variations in accent, grammar, usage, and spelling create dialects, or regional variations of a language. Variations between dialects are large enough that most speakers notice them, but small enough that speakers can understand each other easily. Often the dialect spoken by the most influential group in a country is considered the standard, and others are modifications of it. Hello everyone is standard. Hi y'all or hi yous guys are dialectical variations. Dialects often include distinct adages or sayings that attempt to express a truth about life, such as, the early bird gets the worm. Within dialects are subdialects. For example, in the United States, a native of Texas is likely to speak a different dialect than a native of New York City. Often, dialects are the legacy of differences in the past, but they can also be a first step in the evolution of a new language. Just as the Romance languages emerged as regional variations of Latin, new languages are developing today. For example, if the differences between British English and American English increase so much that speakers could not easily communicate with one another, the two would be classified as different languages instead of dialects of one.